Welcome to Design Downtime, the podcast where we celebrate the joys of living a balanced, creative life. I'm your host, Guy Siegel, a design director in Toronto, Canada, and I invite you to join me on this journey as we redefine what it means to be a successful design professional. Let's break free from the shackles of hustle culture and embrace the full spectrum of human experience, because life is too precious to be spent only in pursuit of productivity. Today, I'm excited to talk to Ryan Rumsey. Ryan is a former tech executive turned author, coach, consultant, and tiny business owner. He's the CEO of Second Wave Dive, founder of Chief Design Officer School, and partner at Jump Ship. Ryan has extensive hands-on product management and executive experience at companies like Apple, Electronic Arts, and USAA. He's the author of the books Business Thinking for Designers and Play Up Your Impact. Ryan, welcome to the show.
Well, thank you for having me.
It is a pleasure. And today you want to talk about something that's a bit different from other topics we've had. You want to talk about a full decade. You want to talk about the 80s.
Yes. Yeah. I am a child of the 1980s, and it has been such a big role of my identity and sort of how I grew up and what I grew up with that it's still very much to this day plays an important part. Second Wave Dive is actually a quote from the 1980 film Flash Gordon. And so even in my company name, the 1980s are very present.
That's amazing. Usually the first question I start with is the origin question, like how did you get to that topic? But I can guess that you got to the 80s by being born at a certain time.
Being born, yeah. So I think I missed peak 80s, like I think what a lot of people imagine the 80s to be, by maybe just 2 or 3 years. So I was born in 74. So my 80s experience was, I would say, more mid 80s and late 80s. I'm old, so I even went to high school in the 80s. That's kind of that generation. You know, I was around when MTV came out, and that was such a formative experience of not just embedding myself in music, but embedding myself in the visual storytelling, this new kind of medium of art, if you will, and creative display, and people not really knowing what to do in a music video. They were very wild. And movies, I would say, played a really important role. So it was really that movies, music, and MTV, I think, played a very formative role in me growing up and kind of experiencing what was happening outside of my neighborhood.
So that's really interesting because other than MTV, which people today don't really know what I would say the real MTV experience was, I have no idea what they even have on MTV today. But other than that, which didn't exist in the previous decades, what for you marks that kind of transition from 70s to 80s?
Well, I was never really in the 70s. You know, I was, if anything, maybe Star Wars, because I was a little too young to see the original film in the theater, but I saw Empire in the theater. And back then, parents would take pretty young kids to go see things. But I saw Empire, and actually my first movie experience was in the 70s. I went to the drive-in with my parents to see 9 to 5. So I vividly remember being in the car and having the speaker in the window. For people who don't maybe know what drive-in theaters were, you would take your car and roll down your window and have an audible speaker, and there'd be this giant outdoor screen. And so I think my experience as well was really formative there because I moved. I had been born and raised in Arizona till I was almost 7. And then we kind of suddenly got up and moved to New Jersey. So all the way across the country. And so I think that marker, in a sense, of a life disruption and moving across was sort of kind of what I would say is like the beginning of me, because then that was the beginning of me moving into the neighborhood where I grew up with and all my friends that I grew up and went to grade school and high school with. And so that was in 1981. And I would say that's the the sort of starting point of course, I have memories before that, but it wasn't really like, oh, this is me and this is my neighborhood. And it was, I would say about then, if anybody has watched Stranger Things, it was very much that similar experience of being on bicycles and going on adventures and having rules that were generally be home by dark. So there was this lots of adventuring and exploring without devices was kind of the way to not be bored.
That's a really interesting point because I was born a year after you. We've been around the same time. And it's absolutely true because similar to you, the first movie I remember seeing in a theater was Empire Strikes Back, and which gave me nightmares for a week after. But we have no memory of what life was in the 70s, right? Our consciousness, let's say, started in the 80s. So we can evaluate the 80s or assess the 80s once we're a bit older and we're looking and we're in the 90s and we're saying, okay, now it's different. Now it feels different. Now it's something a bit. I'm assuming a lot of it had also to do with the fact that we were just growing up and our brains were brains of, young people and early teens. And then later on, we were a bit more mature, maybe.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. It's just sort of circumstantial. It's when our maturity was at a stage that just happened to be at a time and place and, in history. And when you start to kind of develop a sense of self and a sense of humor and a sense of shame or any of those types of things, but also getting more defiant or wanting to stand out on your own from your parents. And I don't know about you, but the interesting thing, that whole, I was kind of like latchkey kid. I grew up in a very non-urban environment. I lived outside of New York City, but it was very small town, leave your keys in the car kind of place. And so my parents were working both full time, and you get home from school and you just ride your bike and you feed yourself and you go to the pizzeria and play stand-up video games. And it was a lot of this autonomy that I think is a bit different from today. That is, again, like you mentioned, at that time where you're figuring yourself out. And so I think that's a big part of why the 80s, holds so much weight for me is as soon as I started paying attention to music and color and my appearance, it happened to be at, this stage of fashion and this stage of movie and this stage of all those things.
Yeah, because with MTV, with arcades, consoles starting to go into homes, right? Video games. I think that's the first decade where you actually have a lot of entertainment that's directed towards younger people and allowing them to be independent.
Right. You think of, I have my Activision shirt on right now, and I had the Atari 2600, and it was this brand new thing that required you to go elsewhere that suddenly was in the house and able to play it in a new way. And with movies, it was still this thing where, cable was still kind of brand new, but you didn't have new movies. Movies that showed up on cable were at least a year old. So you still had this very fun ceremony of going to a movie theater. And back then they didn't have multiplex 10 to 20 movies at a theater. It was a movie. And so you'd have to wait in line around the block. I remember I saw Return of the Jedi 6 times, but I each time waited in these long lines, and we'd see friends in lines. And it was always that, like, don't tell them the story because they're waiting in line, but you're also super excited. This strange innocence at the same time of maybe too much autonomy that I think a lot of Gen Xers got, because at that period, the 80s follows up a lot of the movements of the 60s and 70s when you have women entering the workplace in a very different way. And then, children of the 80s were kind of left alone. I'm not sure if it was the same with you, but we were kind of feral in a way, and I think like any decade, you have fashion obviously playing an important role. And for me in the 80s, it's all neon colors and discovering different styles, whether it's like surfwear, skatewear, bright neon, whatnot. And it's the time of MTV when that show of fashion of different genres really started to show up. Yeah, I think when you're 10, when you're 11, when you're 12, that really plays this formative experience of growing up that I don't think can be replaced by anything else.
Yeah, you're talking about being feral, and I definitely remember staying out, playing in the streets, going from friend's house to friend's house to friend's house, and basically at some point your mom calls you to come home, and that's when you go home.
Right. And they're all landlines, so they have to call 3 different houses to see where anybody is. But there was this like weird trust around that too. There was never a concern. I don't think my parents were ever concerned that I was in danger or anything like that. And I never, as a child, felt worried or anxious that I wasn't around my family. In fact, I think it was maybe the opposite. Like going home was such a drag. I think pop culture for me is really what I connect to most in the 80s. It played such a formative role in me growing up and expressing myself, as watching pop culture and being around that was just fascinating. Yeah, I was a singer as a kid. I was in a touring choir. And so in the back of my mind, I was always going to somehow be, on MTV and do that. I didn't, of course, but there was that connection to performing as a young child and then coming home and watching things like MTV. And I was like, yeah, I could see myself making that jump.
Let's talk a bit about pop culture. What are some of the things that for you are the essence of the 80s and don't think they'll be able to be created the way they were today?
The 80s in many respects was this reaction to the 70s. I think aspects of pop culture that I think can't be replaced are obviously much of that pop culture revolved around cable television being brand new. Prior to that, you had 4 channels. And so you didn't see so much of the world other than through the eyes of nightly news or some type of scripted television show. And that pulp culture of really what we have now an abundance of, way too much of, is live breaking news. Like even CNN came out really in the 80s, and the idea that you would have a 24-hour channel for anything was suddenly a thing. And that switch was such a unique time during the 80s. You had ESPN, you had CNN, you had MTV, you had all these things that weren't just scripted programming, but now live and getting you to pay attention in an all new way. And I think what also happens with that advent comes at a time where you have the HIV and AIDS epidemic, and that being broadcast live, not just what was happening within the epidemic, but multiple sides of a conversation, from those who were very scared and opposed it to those who were fighting for advocacy for gay rights in like a very public pop culture way that was quite different. And the scenes of the 70s of androgyny, and sort of cross-dressing on both sides where it was in the clubs, suddenly in the 80s, it was on TV every day. And that's where I sort of say you can't replace like the effect of something like MTV that it had on that pop culture, because suddenly you're seeing this wide range of creativity and art and expression that was obviously there before, but it wasn't streamed, not streamed, but in your living room, on your TV, no matter where you were. And that was very unique. I think there are also regional pop culture things that were very different. I grew up in New Jersey, right outside New York City. So lots of the styles were the big giant hair, both boys and girls, at that time, they would have this big giant hair and Aquanet. But then through the medium of media, you could see people in California talking in a totally different way and not having that big old hair, but, laid back surfer style, Karate Kid, kind of feathery hair. And that's that type of thing that I don't think you can replace, because now everything, the entire world is scrolling through your feed at all times. And it's not just the culture that you're in, but it's all over the world. So I don't know. What do you think in terms of the 80s and those moments? What can't be replaced?
It's really hard to know, because we have the benefit of hindsight. We have the benefit of distance from the 80s. We can look at socio-political landscape in the 80s and say, oh, I understand why that happened. I understand why this thing was like that. I understand why there was I didn't grow up in North America, but I was exposed, most of the pop culture I was exposed, 99% of it was, Hollywood movies. And there were a lot of things that, after the fact, I know, oh yeah, they were heavily influenced by the Reagan administration. Things that, happened post the end of the Vietnam War, and people taking the law to their hands. How many TV shows were there about people who, go from place to place, they're outlaws, but they help other people because no one else will, right?
Right. Yeah. It's almost like a Robin Hood type of experience, right? But maybe cops,
Exactly.
I love you mentioning film, because I think film in the 80s, it played such this important role, quite differently than it does now. But with, Reagan here in the States, there was also this capitalistic side of now movies. That's when movies transitioned from maybe more art and expression really into this sort of commercial side of big, massive movies. And that perhaps started with Star Wars. But then you had E.T., you had Back to the Future. But even the Oscar-winning films were like these big, giant events. And you had studios showing up to Grauman's Theater. I don't know if you ever saw that, but they would have the idea of a premiere was now broadcast. But two, I think you have that socio-political aspect of film. There were, lots of movies in the 80s you could not remake now at all, because still a lot of hanging on of racist tropes, lots of tropes that were still lingering around. And the 80s was such that it was almost like this Wall Street kind of attitude towards those tropes, and let's party, let's get rich, and, trope.
There's a reason why the 80s action movie is a trope.
Right. My son and we just watched Predator. He's almost 13, and I'm like, all right, let's watch some. And that was one that he's been wanting to watch. And as we're watching it, I was like, oh no, and I had to mute it a couple times because I suddenly remembered this scene coming up, and I was like, oh my God, hit the mute. And I think that action movie genre really set up itself in the 80s. You had obviously war movies before that, but suddenly it's bravado. Even Rambo, that movie in itself was like one guy helping the community in some way.
Yeah, that's actually a good example of the transition, I would say, between the 70s and the 80s, because a lot of the movies in the 70s were about a reaction to, oh, we cannot trust the government. Like, the government is not necessarily working in our benefit. And so the first Rambo movie is him coming back from, I think, Vietnam, and what he finds here. And then, but the second one was already the pure 80s, where this is now state-sanctioned violence.
Yes, and so much of the American films in the 80s were very much a follow-up to the Cold War. So not only do you have Rambo, but Sylvester Stallone was also in Rocky, and the first films, didn't have that political aspect, but then suddenly Rocky 4 comes out and it's, the US versus the USSR, and that trope was in a lot of films. You have Red Dawn as an example of these types of films where it very much like that's very much a runoff of the sort of Reagan effect and glistening hard toned bodies like in any film, but also maybe like weird, strange, fun movies that maybe weren't big box office hits, but then with cable TV became phenomenal. Breakin' 2, Electric Boogaloo, like comes to mind, of this breakdancing movie that I don't think anybody would go to see in the theater, but it was on cable all the time. And I recall watching it a lot. And that inspired me to, try breakdancing and get hall passes at school, coordinate bathroom breaks with friends. We would, I think this is maybe like fifth grade. We would, say, all right, at 10:10, we're going to each ask our homeroom teacher if we can have a bathroom break. And then three of us would go into the bathroom and break dance. I mean, it's so funny now, but that all comes from film and TV and music, all those types of things. I think that was this gateway. These creative arts were a gateway to a lot of self-expression for me.
We talk about pop culture that really reflects its time. Every decade you have those. What are those pop culture milestones for you from the 80s that transcend that are not tied to the specific politics or the specific public sentiment?
I think MTV was this thing that sort of because I wasn't thinking of all those things. I wasn't, being a 9, 10, 11-year-old, you're not thinking of those. But MTV was such that, I would spend hours, as long as my parents let me, watching MTV, even if it was by myself. And it would transport me in a way. I would almost have like out of body, out of mind. And even at the time, I would like pretend that I was in the video. I would sort of creatively spend a lot of time in front of the mirror, kind of trying to reproduce what I saw in the videos. This was all by myself. Nobody, I wasn't doing this with it. But MTV, for one, I think was a massive, massive influence. It's how I discovered new wave. It's how I discovered different aspects of rock and roll. Like my discovery of music, which is how I really connect with myself, is listening to music, I think that's where it was formed. And so it was very pure in this sense of opening up something for me that I hadn't experienced before. I was pretty shy as a kid and reserved, but when I was at home with MTV or even just music playing, I was a completely different person. So that transcends a lot. I think movies too. I have tons of Lego behind me that are 80s, Back to the Future and Star Wars and things like that. I would say the other thing too was sports. I was actually really into sports. I went to my first Yankees game in 1981 and followed baseball. That was my primary sport growing up through the 80s. And that transcended everything, is listening to the Yankees games on the radio, watching them on TV if I could. I loved Don Mattingly. And so I played a lot of sports as a kid too. And each time I can remember even trying to I was a left-handed hitter, Don Mattingly was. And so I would try to stand like him and swing like him. And so all those things I connect back to in many ways, like a screen, a television for the first time. Lots of outdoor time with friends, obviously too, spending time riding bikes. Another one of these things that just kind of gave me autonomy and access in a completely different way. The first time I ever rode my bike far, there were several grade schools in my hometown, and my grade school was a block away, but there was another grade school that you had to pass like the major turnpike. You had to drive or, cross a bridge over a highway to get to. And I just called my mom and said, "Oh, I'd like to go to this school and meet friends there." And she only let me go because she thought I was going, she just misheard and thought I was going to the one a block away. But then suddenly I could ride my bike for miles and go to the little five and dime. And so those are the things that I think transcend all of this, is very, very personal and the things that I reflect on mostly.
You mentioned earlier Stranger Things. So how do you feel about this wave of nostalgia for the 80s?
I mean, it's fun to watch. And in many ways, when I'm watching Stranger Things, my kids are watching it in a very different way, but I'm almost remembering like, oh, that's right. That's how it was, and more of that experience. And so I appreciate that folks are trying to do it. But, in some ways too, it's a little bit nostalgic in a different way. As we get older, I've got 3 kids, and there's this other side that goes like, yeah, like can't get that back, won't get that part back. I appreciate it. I think there's, even in music, when you hear folks like Chappell Roan, you hear a lot of influence coming from 80s music, and Chappell's whole style and Chappell's an alter ego is so similar to what was happening in the 80s. Madonna is an alter ego, these types of things. And so I appreciate it. I'm fond of it. I sometimes wish, like in film, that they would go back to old school claymation or the real, like getting rid of the CGI and getting back into the real physical build out of sets and characters. And I know it's too expensive these days, but yeah, there's a fondness, I would say, for me, that anything that kind of has that type of theme or aspect, I'll likely watch.
So obviously your kids, when they experience things from the 80s, they cannot experience it the way you experience it. But what are you noticing? What are you learning about those things yourselves through their eyes?
It's quite funny. One of the first things I did when we started having kids was I made a list of like, here are all the movies we're going to watch. And early on, I was able to progress through that list. And now they are not interested. Anytime I bring it up, that's such a boring movie. Oh, the animation or the effects are so bad. Like that's all they can really comment on. There's a couple movies that are out there that, may resonate, but even things like Back to the Future, they just find it kind of silly. And so a lot of the movie watching experience with them when I pull something up from the 80s is not like a moving experience. It's not fun. It's almost like, let's make fun of Dad. We'll oblige Dad today. But music, on the other hand, I would say is the opposite. My oldest is about to turn 16 and get their license. So we've been spending, like, a lot of our time is spent in the car with them driving, and they have a rad playlist. They bring up like all these songs they love, and they're all 80s, even late 70s songs. This morning when I was driving them to school, or they were driving, we were listening to The Clash and Blondie, and it's like, wow, all right, you got good taste. And so I really appreciate that. I do bond a lot with my son too, my middle child, over music. We listen to lots of Pink Floyd, Black Sabbath, lots of music from the 80s as well. And so I think music is more of a bonding thing for me with my kids around pop culture than film or TV.
That's awesome. Ryan, where can people find you?
Well, they can find me at a couple places. I do have a little site, just ryanrumsey.com. Not much is there. My main business is secondwavedive.com, but I think for an audience who might be designers, most people are probably familiar with the CDO.school, Chief Design Officer School. That's where I taught cohorts within second wave dive for years and really have now turned it into kind of more of a school type approach, an alternative school type approach through this other brand of CDO school. And then, yeah, you can find me on LinkedIn and those types of places, just as Ryan Rumsey.
Thank you so much for your time. I feel like we've completely summed up the 80s and there's nothing else left to talk about.
Yeah, thank you for giving me time and space to go down and start my day down, nostalgia lane. I'll have to jam out to some music before I jump into my next meeting. I really appreciate you.
What are you going to put on?
Thinking Depeche Mode today, maybe?
Nice.
I don't know if you have a new wave background, but I think it's a Depeche Mode kind of day.
Awesome. Well, enjoy your Depeche Mode.
Thank you.
And thank you again for joining us.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate you.
This is all for this episode of Design Downtime. Thank you for joining me. And until next time, I hope you enjoy your downtime.